Welcome back to my devlog series for Aerodyn, a 2D platformer I've been working on for the past couple of months for my college capstone. As I wrap up development on this project, I'll be making a few retrospective videos looking back over my design process and discussing the lessons I learned along the way. Today we will be focusing on one of my favorite aspects of game design, art direction. While game mechanics were arguably the most important aspect of my project, art and character design come the most naturally to me. At the same time, I found art is also one of the most time-consuming parts of the process, so I employed a number of strategies to expedite it as much as possible. We'll be covering some of those in this video. Here we will cover the overall art direction of Aerodyn, along with a more focused look at character art and environment art specifically. Along the way, we will cover the strategies I used to achieve the final look in my game. Let's not waste any more time and dive right in. Even before writing up my concept of the core gameplay, I had a fairly clear idea of the art direction I wanted to pursue. Like many of my other projects, I chose to emulate a retro game art style, with minimal shading, pixel graphics. It's a style you probably recognize. This is ideal because it requires less time to create, but can still be high quality if done properly. In particularly, I wanted to focus on achieving fluid animations and detailed sprite work, rather than the standard blocky visuals commonly associated with retro games. A sprite, by the way, is just a 2D image used in a game. To fit the fluid, airy feel of the game, I chose a soft pastel color scheme. This would open the door for atmospheric perspective, where colors in the background are less saturated than the foreground, to really give the stage the feeling of being out in the open. Items of interest could also be highlighted in black to make them easier to see, which allows the game to be easily readable even if the player is moving quickly, which they should be if the level design is achieving its purpose. But more important than the environment art, or the interactable objects to me, was the character art, which is where I started with my art design. In almost every game, the player sprites and animations are the most important to get right. After all, you'll be looking at them for most of the game. This is even more so for such movement-centric games, since it's essential that the player be able to tell what their character is doing and where they are at all times. Feedback for each of the player's inputs is also essential, considering how many context-dependent abilities there are in my game specifically. So it should be understandable that I dedicated a substantial amount of time into workshopping and animating my player character. At the halfway point of the project, I had something like this. I'm still really proud of how these sprites came out. They perfectly reflected my vision of floaty yet dynamic movement, have tons of readable poses, and just look really appealing in general. But just because it perfectly fit my original vision, doesn't mean the sprites themselves were perfect. In fact, they aren't even the ones that I'm using in the final version of the game. This is because when I assessed my progress halfway through development, I realized I had two big problems on my hands. First, animating the character in this style would take way too long. These multi-frame animations look really nice, but replicating comparable visual fidelity on the player's remaining moves, not to mention the backgrounds and various game objects, would simply be impossible in the time I had left. Even worse was the second problem. The sprites themselves were too big and detailed for my platformer. When working on the sprites, I saw them at about this size in the game editor. While they look amazing at this scale, in-game the character is much smaller, about this size. Suddenly, those beautiful poses and animations blur together into an unrecognizable mess. Plus, I'd have to rework the prototype player to fit the taller character sprite, which was just another hurdle that wasn't worth clearing in the long run. So in the end, I made the difficult decision to scrap my existing work and start from scratch. I redesigned the character, this time keeping its small size in mind from the start, and with the goal of it being much faster to animate the different moves. In the end, I made this. It has the same basic design, just shrunk down to a much smaller sprite, about 1/8 of the original to be exact. And, in my opinion, it still looks great. I guess the takeaway here is that even when dealing with game art, visual fidelity isn't all that matters. Clarity and practicality are also essential. Even with the faster approach to character art, though, I was still running out of time to make all the other sprites, environments, backgrounds, game objects, and so on. Making the objects at least was simple enough, since I only needed a few looping sprites for various states. Much simpler than the player, but about the same size. What was a challenge was covering the massive level I had made, considering how time-consuming it had been to whitebox the level to begin with. You can only imagine how much longer it would take to place art assets such that it matched the level design perfectly. Fortunately for me, Unity already had a system in place that perfectly matched my needs, the tile map system. A tile map is useful for grid-based games, such as top-down games or side-scrollers. In these styles, each image is split up into distinct square-shaped tiles, usually fitting a pattern like this. The pattern on the sprite is repeated across each sprite, allowing them to be assembled into large, complex shapes that are still continuous, essentially fitting together like a puzzle. With this in mind, I created a tile map myself using a handful of sprite sheets, or images that contain several different sprites. They look something like this. Because the tiles themselves are evenly spaced, they can be split apart and assigned to a tile map in Unity. And from there, it's as easy as painting over the white map with the correct tiles. I even made a second sprite sheet with a different style to create some visual variety, and the two could be combined into several interesting configurations. I took a similar approach to the background, but this time I used a single, large sprite rather than multiple tiles. The sprite itself, though, loops horizontally, such that it connects to itself side by side. I animated a few elements of the background sprite so it wouldn't feel as static. Then, once I imported it into the game, I created a basic parallax scrolling script to give it a sense of depth. Basically, whenever you're in motion, objects that are farther away appear to be moving more slowly than objects that are nearby, which is referred to as the parallax effect. Parallax scrolling in games is a visual trick that replicates the same effect, in this case by moving a background object as the camera moves, giving the illusion that it's further away. These two examples highlight the important interactions between programming and art to create compelling visual effects. I would never have been able to create a single sprite that perfectly matched the level I'd created, or generate an actual 3D environment for the background, but using clever programming and Unity tools allowed these effects to be simulated in much less time. Even the player character, which I had already created animated sprites for, benefited from a few keyframed squash and stretch animations for more impactful movements. This saved me the trouble of having to create unique animations for these specific moves, and the effect is likely better than what I would have made if I tried. I think that covers enough of the visual design for Aerodyn. In the next video, we will be exploring the programming side of the project a bit more, along with an important discussion on scope in game design. Thanks, and I hope to see you then.